Welcome to Transformation Heroes by Feedia. Companies are the greatest platform of change, and we are looking in this series to dedicate to the professionals that are looking to make the biggest impact and want to grow their customer base. We'll be exploring topics like AI, LLM, security challenges, hiring, CRM, and much, much more. And the series, Transformation Heroes, will be able to hopefully guide you through this as our expertise is focused on customer experience. We look forward to you joining us and thank you so much. Hello and welcome to another episode of Transformation Heroes, joined once again by François and myself. And today we're going to be looking at the limitations of NPS, the Net Promoter Score. So why don't we just jump straight into it? NPS is often used as an industry standard. It's often the kind of torch that helps companies guide the way in terms of their customer experience. So very briefly, François, if you don't mind explaining what the Net Promoter Score is and why is it used so much?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Carlos. So NPS was an indicator created in the US by Bain and Company, 2003, I believe. And what's very interesting with this KPI is it's been massively adopted over the last 20 years. Like I think a big chunk of the S&P 500 is using it on not more than yearly, like on a weekly or monthly basis to make, like decisions or whether they're doing a good job at keeping their customers and that's providing a good customer experience. And what's also very interesting with this indicator is it shows it's very hard to be good because basically you take, like all the promoters, so people that reply to the question, how would you recommend your company to a friend or colleague between 0 and 10? And promoters would be people replying 9 and 10, and detractors would be people replying from 0 to 6. You take percentage of promoters, remove percentage of detractors, and it's very hard because as you can see, like you have detractors 0 to 6, promoters only 9 and 10. So it's very tough to be good at this one. And I think that's why it's been, like massively used by companies. One interesting point as well, it's not a percentage, it's a score between minus 100 and 100. And yeah, I think we could talk about NPS for hours. So I think we'll just focus on the limitations today, and there are quite a few.
Okay. So I mean, we can jump straight to the kind of main problem. One of the main problems that we have is that it's used everywhere, as you explained. A statistic I have is 2/3 of the Fortune 1000, so double the S&P 500 are using that as a gauge of quality and customer experience. It's also quite simplistic in its format. The question itself is very, very standardized. How would you recommend this product or service to a friend or colleague? And also, it doesn't necessarily give an indication of churn, because if someone might just leave the company, for example, you might just lose that contact. And, for a B2B perspective, perhaps asking about recommendation of, an airline part, for example, that you're selling, potentially your uncle is probably not going to buy that as well. So could you maybe explain, in your opinion, why NPS to you is not as good as one might think?
Well, I think the first limitation is that, like as most CX indicators, like if you want to transform your company, you have to measure what people think. That's true, but also you will have a lot of customers that are not going to express themselves. And therefore, if you make decisions based on your NPS score, you have to be very careful that it represents at least a big chunk of your customers. Because if you make decisions, and we have some customers that do that, like if you have like 2% of your customer base that gives you NPS score, and then you take that metrics and say like that's the company's North Star metrics, it's as important as our turnover. It can be quite lead you to the wrong direction because it's not going to reflect all the like the real value and the real feeling of your customers. So one thing is making sure that like you don't rely just on NPS when it comes to customer experience. Like there's a lot of other indicators like CSAT, CES, and so on. But also making sure that overall when you have an NPS score, you understand very well where it's coming from, and you make sure it's not a yearly measure, but it's a real-time measure, like you have it on a weekly basis. Because if you do that just on the yearly basis, which like quite a lot of companies like are still doing it on a yearly basis with like consultant audits and so on. It's not really actionable, and it doesn't really reflect what's really happening on the ground on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I think another thing to add as well, you mentioned CSAT. It's not necessarily picking up support tickets. It's not necessarily picking
Yeah.
up online reviews. It's not giving you that kind of holistic viewpoint that you would actually really need to take action.
Yeah, and
Um,
it's on one very specific moment of the customer journey. And as you've mentioned, like Google reviews, like support ticket when things go wrong, like you're always going to, like you have less control. Whereas like NPS, you're in total control of the flow. You know who you're asking. You know after which moments of the journey, like whether it was good or not good. And so like I think this level of control is good because you keep the data for yourself. It's not published online, but also it can be dangerous if you make it your only indicator for customer experience, or if you manage the whole company with NPS, simply because again, like it doesn't reflect the whole truth. And also there's a big difference between, like we mentioned NPS here, NPS there, NPS here, NPS, but there's big difference between like NPS, for example, in customer support, like after you have a call with an agent, what's your NPS? And like on your website. Like
Mhm.
these two NPS scores are absolutely not uh, the same thing, because you're talking to a customer that already bought your product, you're talking to a visitor on the other side.
Yeah,
And I think when you just mention NPS, it can be confusing.
absolutely. Now, focusing a little bit more on the calculation itself, you've mentioned this already, but the NPS calculation completely ignores passives. So
Yeah.
those that score 7 or 8 out of 10. Um, how would you, from your opinion, identify or those passive customers? What would you do in terms of that particular limitation?
Like I think what's interesting and to see is if you are a CX professional or someone that looks to like improve your company, your product services on a daily basis, like you have a lot of insights from your NPS, but very often like people will just focus on the detractors, so people which are 0 to 6, like very dissatisfied. Whereas like sometimes if you want to improve, and most times actually if you want to improve um, NPS, a very good way to do this as well is to attack the passive segments, simply because they are usually you have more than hopefully than detractors,
Mm.
and also they are easier to convince and to take them from the passive segments to the promoter segments. And there are a couple of ways of going around it. First one is to identify them, because by itself the NPS doesn't do that. As we've mentioned, it's just percentage of promoters minus percentage of detractors. So no passive in the equation. And then making sure that when you have this group identified, you can do specific actions, specific insights to improve their customer experience. And I think that's also where text analysis come into place. Is usually with NPS surveys, you have a lot of text insights. And if you can capture or find way to, when someone answers 8 or 7, have a follow-up question, which is very specific, and it can be, like a an option question with different, like, why are you not a promoters? You don't want to say it this way, but that's, like kind of my point. Like, what are we missing to reach 9 or 10? Like, I think that will give you some insight. And again, like focusing on this is usually from a CX point of view going to lie better result than if you were to just focus on the detractors, which most of the time they're not necessarily going to leave, but they're going to, because they're using your product services, so it doesn't necessarily equal to churn, but they are harder to convince.
Yeah, so as part of the customer experience survey that you would give out, you
Yeah.
would add targeted flow to not only look at the detractors or the promoters, but also target the passives. Because, yeah, as you
Yeah.
say, it's easier to convert the passives to promoters than it would be to get the detractors up all the way across the scale.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And if you look at the math, like it's just easier. And yet, most, I would say, like CX program, they will aim at the detractors.
Mm.
That's why it's a limitation of the score itself.
Okay. Now, moving on to another subject, Tatiana Mahmoud, an investor and advisor of a company called T Mahmoud. she quotes, they use NPS to drive people up a commitment curve, which I really like that quote. It's from a podcast called Churn FM. I recommend anyone to take a look and listen into that. But she basically is talking about going through a performance kind of process when it comes to NPS. So I wondered, in your perspective, how reliable is NPS as a predictor of something like financial performance, for example? And are there any other kind of metrics that could be used alongside?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So it's like I think that's one of the key subjects of the next couple of years when it comes to NPS is how do you tie it to financial outcome. Uh, there has been research on this. I'm going to quote. I have my quotes as well, Carlos, but I don't have them on top of my mind. There's a book from the NPS founder Fred Richmond, which is called "Winning on Purpose," which was released, I believe, in 2021. And I think what's very interesting in this book is he actually took a cohort of company that were, like all public companies, and he compared the financial performance, so not really the financial performance, but the return to investors in terms of value created, and he correlated this with the one that were having the most, the higher NPS score. And it's very, very interesting because what he found, and again, I encourage anyone to read this book. Like what is the key highlight is that the company which have the higher NPS in the group are going to have a 26% increase in total value created for the investors. And so there is a long-term value creation for companies that have a strong NPS. But again, like this is absolutely nothing new. Like we already know that for like maybe not 20 years, but like 10 years. It's been pretty clear in the US and more clear in Europe in the last couple of years. But I think at the end of the day, it's okay, well, how does it end up my bottom line on a daily basis? And this is still a question to be answered because like it doesn't really, you can have a detractor, it doesn't mean it's going to leave. It can be correlated with the fact that it's going to leave, but until you have data such as the customer lifetime value, that you have the churn cost, that you have the support costs, like until you have these pieces of data, like it's very hard to make it actionable.
And what are your thoughts in terms of like contextual information? You talk about kind of the financial data. Is there anything else that you would find useful for collecting the NPS?
Yeah, so of course you want to have other sources of information because by itself the NPS isn't actionable if you just have a score. But I think before we touch on this, like what would be in the book, there's something that's very interesting, which is called the earned growth rate, which is basically if you ask your customers before they do business with you, where are you coming from? And if you can identify in your customer base the one that comes from recommendation, so basically, like coming from the promoters group, it's very interesting because then now you can actually put a number in terms of, okay, my NPS of 9 and 10, like the promoters, they are, like from a business perspective, they're bringing me X new customers every single month, every single year. And then you can quantify the business result on a daily basis. But the only operational change that you have to do as a CX professional is to ask your customers and make sure that when they start doing business with you, you know exactly if they are coming from a promoter, so from someone else that recommended your company or service before. And if this is the case, it's very straightforward to put a like business case that says, okay, well, here is the NPS impact.
Okay. Now, I would love to go into the context side of things, just because I think it's something that paints the data you're seeing. It really gives you not just a very small view, but a wide-angled view of your customer experience data. I got another quote from Adam Dorrell, who's the CEO of Customer Gauge, and he mentions that you need to act on the feedback, and ideally, tackle the negative feedback within 48 hours, have an SLA in place, but also, and this is the crucial thing for me that I took from what he's mentioned, but also measure your global score with other indicators alongside that. So you have your context information, you have your indicators. What data, what things would you say would be important for CX professionals to collect alongside NPS?
Yeah, well, the thing with NPS is again like it's just a score. And if there is no gradients to the score, so if there's no different shades of this score, it's very hard to act. And again, you might not be a sales professional, but let's say you want to improve your products and you're more on the product side. Like if you have a product NPS by itself, it's absolutely not actionable. Like you need to get the NPS by product version, by type of user, by page they're using. And if you have these different uh, dimensions, this new dimension, well, then it makes it a lot easier. Like it's easier for you to actually take action on a daily basis because you know exactly where to focus. And I think that's also, like the point with customer intelligence is to say, okay, how do I bring in what people think with the data I have to be very, very precise in terms of action and insights that I'm going to deliver. And like I have another example in mind, which I think is interesting as well, is if you were to be a transportation system in a city, like your NPS by itself doesn't mean any, like it, again, you cannot do anything about it because, like you may have like different way of transportation in this, like you can have the subway, you can have like the bus system, like all of these are very different. And then you have the different bus lines with the different routes and so on. And until you can correlate all of this information, it's very hard to action. When you actually do correlate with the NPS data. When was that person subscribed? Like, is it someone that just subscribed to the transportation system this year or someone that has been there for 20 years? Is this on this line or this line? Like, when you can find this information, like your job gets a lot easier because you can solve the real problem. And then you can also quantify, getting back to your last point, you can quantify the business impact because then you can say, okay, well, 5 subscribers, or maybe 5 is not enough, like 500 subscribers, detractors on this line, we have to change this line because this line is costing us like a lot of money from a detractor standpoint, from a support standpoint, and we have to take action.
Yeah, and a lot of these businesses have this operational data as well. They have it
Yeah,
already
exactly.
in their databases. Hopefully not on Excel sheets anymore, but
No, but yeah, hopefully. But they, like 20 years ago, like they did not have that AI. I think the very good news with digitalization is now you have all of this data which is available for you. So use it to improve because again, like if you can correlate to NPS or other CX NPS, like magic can start to happen.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the idea is not only are you looking at the operational data, but you can also focus on a particular touch point as well. So along that journey of the bus route, there might be a specific moment that you want to target because there's roadworks happening there, and you know that it's slowing. There's a potential that there's delays to the route, for
Yeah.
example. Um,
And, and
yeah,
and that's why, like, again, spending time on the like day to day versus like doing it once per year or once per quarter is such a better idea. And also, like, again, was not possible when you used to have like consultants do it for you on a quarter basis, on a yearly basis. But now with like the like the CRM expansion, like with all the marketing tools and so on, like this information is here. And I think another point as well, Carlos, is like with the rise of AI as well, is now like analyzing thousands and thousands of pieces of text feedback, like of
yes,
people complaining, of people like or saying nice thing about the drivers in the transportation system. Like this data was very hard to account, and before it was basically saying like, okay, this week here are 5. Let's review all detractors and the promoters, and here are the feedback. And now what you can do, thanks to AI, is you can say, okay, here are the 5,000 we received this week, and here are the key insights out of the 5,000. And now you can also correlate this with all of your business systems, so it's very, very focused. And then you can find very clear action plans based on both the operational data that you have and also the NPS data that you have.
absolutely. And you can also be like, oh, bus driver Sally has received incredible feedback because she's always got a smile, or she's always welcoming everyone on
Yep.
board, or yeah. And those are the types of things that you also want to focus on, not just the negative side, but also the fact that you can praise your staff members that are going above and beyond, because
Yeah.
now we have the way of connecting an NPS or an indicator with the text information.
Yeah, and also two things, Carlos, on this. One is it used to be something just for large companies before. Like I would say in the last 10 years, it's been something that was massively just for like very large companies that could afford all of this. Like right now, that's no longer the case. Like you can be a 100 people company, a 500 people division of a larger company that used to not have the budget to do this. And now you can actually do it, which was absolutely not possible before. And the second point, like we are talking today about like NPS limitation. Maybe we'll do another episode on why NPS is also a very good indicator, and do kind of like the counter arguments of our points. But I think when you mention, like that driver having this smile and making his passengers happy, like I think one key element of NPS as well to keep in mind is that it is such an up-to-date metric. And some people have said in the past, like, okay, NPS is going to disappear, like no one's tracking it. Like NPS does show you whether your company is living its mission. Like, are you truly making your customers better using your company? And if you look at all great company that we have in top of our mind, like the one that's, like the Amazon, the Apple, the Tesla, they all have stellar NPS scores. And that's a testimonial to the score itself to say like, okay, it's been there for a while. There are limitations. You have to be aware of the limitation. Yet, like when you try to look for new people to join your company, to have mission-driven companies, well, NPS is a very good proof of whether you're doing a good job at this or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, zooming out a little bit, we've talked about kind of the context around NPS and the kind of limitations on that end. Going more into maybe the question itself, so the design, I'd like to know if you've got any thoughts on potential cognitive biases that might rise from the NPS question itself.
Like, I think what's interesting is, like when you compare a turnover with or a quarter growth with the NPS, is one is very much human driven, the other one is very much business driven. And the NPS being a human driven indicator means it has cognitive challenges. Sorry. Yes, and you can see it a lot. Like if you open your mailbox, and again, like as people that probably already have NPS surveys in place for listeners, whether you in the NPS design you have the 9 and 10 green and 0 to 8 red, like you're going to have a higher NPS. And if like every single number was black, that's that's for sure. And if you have a description that says, okay, well, like if you like your experience, please reply 10, otherwise skip the question. Again, you are asking the same question, but with the description, with the call, you can have like completely different scores. And I'll give you another example from a colleague at Fidio, who actually had his internet set up by his internet provider, and the technician that was doing the installation actually was like, in order to activate your internet connection, you're going to receive a survey, you need to click 10. which is again, and if you were to do, it was like, if you click 10, that will enable your internet connection. And when you think about it, like the reason why is the technician did this is simply because his salary depends on his NPS score. So of course he wants to, like again, humans. So you so you want to be very careful between like, oh, I'm a CX professional, I'm going to say the perfect NPS program, which is going to impact people's weights. So, but like sometimes you can have stuff like this on the ground. And so yeah, you want to be honest with that NPS score and make sure that you don't correlate just salaries or personal salaries with NPS score, because otherwise you end up with such.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if it's your livelihood depends on getting a positive score. I can totally understand why an individual might want to do that. And so that you have to kind of take the emotion out, but also keep it in to an extent, which it gets a bit tricky. We talked quite a bit about the flaws at this stage. Would you have any alternatives for CX professionals in terms of, we've mentioned a little bit about CSAT.
Yeah, well, I think NPS is still the north. Like for the reason we've explained, like I think again, he has limitation, not a problem. Like just you have to be aware of the limitation and like act in consequence. But at the end of the day, it's very easy to understand. It's very easy to communicate, and it's still very good. There are other metrics again, like CES, more for customer support, customer score. But again, like one other thing that we highly recommend is when it comes to customer intelligence, like NPS is just part of the picture. It's not the whole picture. So you want to make sure that you just want to make sure that you don't just rely on the NPS. And for example, tracking sentiment in your support tickets, tracking topics in your support tickets, tracking Google Trustpilot reviews. Like this is as important because you have less control, and yet like it's a very good proof or show of like your actual customer experience on the ground.
I'm really glad you said that, because I've got another quote. It's like all these quotes are not really quotes; they're kind of just bits that I've chopped up and made my own to an extent. But Greg Danes, he's CEO and founder of a company called Client Velocity, and he has done a lot of research with his team, looking at trends between customer satisfaction and NPS, and customer retention. And his team found absolutely no correlation between customer satisfaction and customer retention, um, because essentially, if you're answering that survey, there is a level of commitment involved to that, and it's the ones often that don't answer at all that are the ones to worry about. But also, it can be very reactionary. It can be off that moment, off that particular time, and it might not actually reflect the whole kind of overall reflection of an experience. So, with that in mind, what strategies should businesses adopt to ensure that NPS reflects not just immediate customer reactions, but kind of wider feeling and sentiment?
Yeah, well, I think there are 2 points to this. There's a first limitation about like industry benchmark, which is basically saying, okay, like your NPS, and what you've just touched on, Carlos, is it's very like people and like CX professionals tend to compare the NPS with their peers, which can be problematic because if you think about it, like if it's not measured at the same time in the customer journey, as we just said, like if it can be just a reactive experience post support or a visitor, like you have two NPS scores which have nothing to do with each other. And that's why like if you want to compare NPS, like you have to make sure that the NPS is measured with the same question, the same design at the same moment of the customer journey. Otherwise, it makes no sense to compare it at all. Because again, it's just not reflecting reality. And then there is also a second and probably like another limitation based on this, which is NPS by itself, same as without the context, it's not actionable. Without the proper timeline, it's not actionable neither because it's just a figure, right? It's just a KPI. So you want to, and it's not going to reflect long-term trends. It's going to be as true as the moment you measure it. And that's why if you want a better visibility or more intelligence or what your customer wants, you want to measure it every single day. So then you have real-time customer intelligence. But if you don't, like if you take action because you have a bad NPS, like it's bad versus what? Because if it's versus your competitors, again, if they measure it and the 0 to 8 is red and like you're fighting against the wrong, you're probably fighting against the wrong param. Whereas like if you were to follow it and measure it on a very regular basis, such as weekly, and then making sure that you identify the trends and that you do correlate it with your business data, well, then it can be a very, very powerful tool because it lets you exactly focus on the right thing that will drive business forward. And I think like if you have these two limitations, so you don't fight against the problem because you're benchmarking stuff, indicators which are not comparable by themselves. And then that you're also like looking at the global trend rather than the day-to-day trend. I think then it's, it's a very powerful weapon as a CX professional.
Absolutely. And I mean, from the research I've done and from my personal experience as well, I've noted that customer satisfaction is obviously very, very important. But for the NPS to really work, it's all about result-driven action. So as you mentioned, using the results you're getting to then drive a customer experience plan forward, and not just be like, this is my indicator, this is what this means, that's my benchmarking that I'm going to be tracking. To kind of wrap this up a little bit, now I would love for you to kind of help me summarize what we've talked about, because we've talked about a lot of different things, whether it be context, whether it be the design. If we could maybe come up with maybe 5 key bullet points of the limitations, but also how we can take NPS forward.
Yeah. Well, I think first one, to 7 limitations. First one, like making sure that you are aware that your NPS doesn't reflect all your customers. It just reflects people that reply to your surveys, and therefore it doesn't reflect the whole truth. And if you make decisions just based on the NPS, you're probably missing a big part of what your customers think. I think the second one, which we've touched on, which is as important, is making sure that you understand that there is a big opportunity in the passive segments of the NPS, which is often forgot. But again, like you will have a lot of passive, and it's much easier to take them from the passive state to the promoter state than to, again, like just solve for detractors. The third one, so number 3, is make it a financial indicator. So find ways to correlate your NPS with your financial results, because then it's going to drive change at a much faster pace. And it's just not going to be about like whether the driver is smiling or not, but also, like how does that affect the bottom line of the business. Number 4, context. If you have no context, NPS is absolutely not actionable. Number 5, like NPS is a human indicator, so you have to be careful about how it is asked. Because if you ask it again with the wrong color or with a description that says, please reply 10, otherwise your internet connection is not going to be enabled, as we've pointed out in the example, like that is absolutely not truthful, right? It doesn't reflect the reality of what your customers are doing on the ground or what they're feeling about your business on the ground. So it defeats the whole purpose, right? And then NPS, you want to benchmark it. Sounds like a good idea, but be careful that it's like that you benchmark the same moment in the customer journey, because again, NPS visitor versus NPS on your website versus NPS after a customer support call is not going to be the same at all. And then last but not least, making sure that you keep the time dimension in your NPS analysis, which I think most companies do that, and it's pretty straightforward. Like again, it is a picture at a given moment. So you have to make sure before you take action and say like, oh, NPS is bad. Like again, it is bad regarding what? Like versus like compared to something like last week, last quarter. And I think if you do all of this, NPS, and if you're aware of all of this limitation, NPS can be a very powerful way to take an organization from we don't listen to our customers and we don't really care about what customers think to we are customer driven. And there is a long way to go from, NPS every year to an Amazon, which is, like the most customer first company in the world. But again, like NPS is one of the tools to do this.
Yeah, and if I were to,
that
was a lovely summary. Thank you. You remembered all 7 points. That's quite the memory.
I cheated, to be honest. I have the piece of paper.
If I were to garnish it with a little bit of my point of view, I would mention as well, just as I mentioned before, make sure your results are data driven, but also results driven. So you take action on those results. You use that as your new baseline for you to take action moving forward.
Yeah,
François, it's been a pleasure as always. Thanks so much for joining.
Carlos, likewise.
Talk to you soon.
Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.